Imagine our world, not as a blue marble, but as a sphere wrapped in chains. Chains forged not from iron, but from gold coins. Stamped across this globe is a single impossible number, $315 trillion. That is the sum of all global debt. A person looks at this figure and a simple logical question forms in their mind. If every single country on Earth is in debt, who exactly do we owe the money to? Is there another planet lending us cash? The answer is both simple and deeply disturbing. The world owes the money to itself. This isn't some cooperative savings pool. It's a meticulously designed system, a machine that functions with one primary purpose: to siphon wealth silently and continuously from the hands of the many and concentrate it into the accounts of the few. This system didn't just appear, it was built, engineered by visionary or perhaps cynical minds over centuries. Call them the four architects. To understand the machine, we have to start with the first. His name was William Paterson, and the year was 1694. Before Paterson, government finance was a chaotic affair. Imagine a king, desperate to fund a war, practically begging wealthy merchants for a loan. The merchants might agree, but they knew the risks. Kings were notoriously bad clients. They defaulted, they lost wars, they died, and when they did, the loan died with them, leaving the lenders ruined. It was a high-risk, unstable way to run an empire. Paterson saw this problem not as a risk, but as an opportunity to create something entirely new. Paterson's solution was audacious. He proposed a deal to the King of England. A private company of investors, which would become the Bank of England, would grant the government a massive loan. But here was the ingenious, revolutionary twist. The government would never have to repay the principal amount, ever. Instead, the government would simply pay interest on that loan, in perpetuity, forever. The king got his money, and the bankers got a guaranteed, endless stream of income. But where would this eternal interest payment come from? It would be secured by a new source of revenue: direct taxation of the public. Suddenly, the flow of money was clear. Tax revenue flowed from the citizens into the government's treasury, and then a portion was immediately paid out to the private bank. A perfect self-sustaining loop was created. This single innovation changed everything. Debt was no longer a temporary liability to be settled. It was transformed into a permanent asset for the lender, a secure interest-bearing bond guaranteed by the full faith and taxing power of the state. To represent this new form of wealth, the bank created a new instrument: the bank note. This wasn't just paper money. It was a physical claim on the future labor and productivity of the entire country. A claim on taxes that hadn't even been collected yet from people who hadn't even been born. The system was born, but it was local. To rule the world, the debt needed to travel across oceans, binding nations together in a web they could not see. In the early 19th century, this web was spun not by kings or generals, but by bankers. At its center sat Nathan Mayer Rothschild, an architect of a new financial order. From his base in London, he extended his family's influence, creating an unparalleled network connecting the great financial hubs of Europe: Paris, Frankfurt, Vienna. His true genius wasn't just in lending money, but in transforming the very nature of debt. Rothschild pioneered a system where government bonds, the IOUs of entire nations, were no longer confined to their domestic markets. He made them tradable internationally. Suddenly, a banker in London could buy the debt of the Austrian Empire, and the financier in Paris could invest in the future of Great Britain. This wasn't just a financial innovation. It was a fundamental rewiring of international power. The economic fates of rival nations were now inextricably linked, creating a delicate interdependence where the stability of one was tied to the solvency of all. This new reality was dramatically tested in 1815 at Waterloo. As Napoleon's army clashed with Wellington's, the future of Europe hung in the balance. But for Rothschild, it was an opportunity. His network of carrier pigeons delivered news of Napoleon's defeat to London hours before official channels. While the market panicked over rumors of a British loss, sending bonds into a freefall, Rothschild began to act. He publicly sold bonds, deepening the crash. Then, as prices hit rock bottom, his agents secretly bought up everything. When the official news finally arrived, the market soared and Rothschild's fortune multiplied. But the real lesson of Waterloo wasn't just about profit. It was a demonstration of a new rule. Interconnected debt makes default impossible. If one major nation failed to pay its debts, the resulting contagion would collapse the entire system, dragging everyone down. The web had become a cage from which no nation could escape. A century later, the design would be perfected across the Atlantic. We moved to America, 1913. The nation was plagued by financial panics, with no central authority to stabilize the banking sector. The third architect of our system, the titan of industry J.P. Morgan, saw the need for a solution, one crafted on his terms. In total secrecy, he convened a meeting of the country's most powerful financiers and politicians on a remote private retreat, Jekyll Island, Georgia. For over a week, these men, representing a quarter of the world's wealth, hammered out a plan. The result of this clandestine summit was the blueprint for the Federal Reserve. It was sold to the public as a mechanism for economic stability, but at its core was an ingenious mechanism, a kind of magic trick. The Federal Reserve could create money from thin air. It would then use this newly created money to buy bonds directly from the government. In one clean transaction, the government received cash to spend, and the central bank held the debt. A perfect, self-contained loop. This loop created something the world had never seen before: infinite demand for government debt. Previously, a government's ability to borrow was limited by the public's willingness to lend, but now it had a guaranteed buyer with bottomless pockets. If investors in the open market didn't want to buy government bonds, the Federal Reserve could and would simply create the money to do so. Think of it as a printing press, both real and digital, that could run endlessly to finance the state. This system fundamentally severed the traditional link between government spending and the taxes it collected from its citizens. It effectively unshackled politicians from the hard constraints of a budget, fueling a perpetual cycle of borrowing and spending on a scale previously unimaginable. It was the ultimate financial tool, giving the government a credit card with no limit. But a credit card is useless if the bill collector cannot enforce payment. So the final architect created the global enforcer. His name was Paul Volcker, and in the early 1980s, as chairman of the U.S. Federal Reserve, he faced a single enemy: rampant inflation. His solution was brutal and direct. He raised interest rates to levels that seem like a fantasy today, a move known as the Volcker shock. The federal funds rate skyrocketed, peaking at a staggering 20%. While this was a domestic policy aimed at cooling the U.S. economy, its shockwaves were global. Across the developing world, nations like Mexico and Argentina, which had borrowed heavily in U.S. dollars during the cheaper, low-interest years, were suddenly caught in a financial tidal wave. Their variable rate loans recalibrated overnight. The cost to simply make their payments exploded, becoming an impossible, crushing weight. Widespread panic set in. Entire countries built on the promise of growth were now staring into the abyss of total economic default, their financial sovereignty hanging by a thread. As these nations teetered on the brink, a supposed savior emerged, the International Monetary Fund, or IMF. But they didn't arrive with a lifeline, they arrived with a ledger. They weren't there to forgive the debt that was crippling these economies. They were there to restructure it. This is the heart of the bailout trap. The initial offer of help, the symbolic handshake, slowly morphed into something much more sinister. The grip tightened, the fingers interlocked, and the handshake became a pair of inescapable handcuffs. In exchange for new loans just to pay the interest on the old loans, the IMF demanded absolute compliance. Stringent austerity measures were imposed. Governments were forced to slash public spending on healthcare, education, and infrastructure. And most critically, they were mandated to sell off their crown jewels. Valuable state-owned assets, their natural resources, their public utilities, their telecommunications networks, were privatized and sold, often at bargain basement prices, to foreign corporations, all just to generate enough cash to keep servicing the interest on a debt that was never shrinking. This moment marked a fundamental shift in the very concept of debt. The goal was no longer to one day pay it off and achieve freedom. That dream was extinguished. The new reality was an indefinite sentence of servicing debt. Picture a hamster on a wheel, running furiously, its legs a blur of motion, pouring all its energy into the effort, yet never moving an inch forward. This is the reality for a nation trapped in this cycle. The principal amount of the original loan remains largely untouched, a permanent fixture on the national balance sheet. But the interest payments, they must flow forever. The system ensures a continuous, perpetual transfer of wealth from the debtor nations to their international creditors. It's not a bug in the system. It is the system itself, a perfectly designed machine for economic subjugation, ensuring that escape is not an option. This machine wasn't built overnight. It was the masterwork of 4 key architects, each adding a crucial component to its design. William Paterson made it permanent, establishing the Bank of England and institutionalizing the very concept of national debt. The Rothschild family then made it global, weaving an international web of finance that entangled governments across continents. J.P. Morgan made the system infinite, creating the financial structures and central banking power that allowed debt to expand without limit. And finally, Paul Volcker, with his interest rate shock, made it inescapable. He sprung the trap, leveraging monetary policy as a weapon to enforce global compliance and lock the final piece of the cage into place. Look closely at a modern worker's paycheck. Past the gross income, the hourly rate, the hours worked, there's a line item simply labeled tax. It's a number we've been conditioned to accept as a civic duty, the cost of a functioning society. But where does that money actually go? A significant portion is sent to the Internal Revenue Service. From the IRS, it flows into the vast accounts of the U.S. Treasury. And from the Treasury, a torrent of these funds is directed to pay interest to the holders of government bonds. These bondholders are not average citizens. They are overwhelmingly wealthy institutions, foreign governments, and the most affluent individuals on the planet. This isn't a simple transaction. It is a direct transfer of wealth, siphoned from the daily labor of millions and deposited into the accounts of those who own capital. The path is intentionally opaque, but the destination is crystal clear, from the hands of the working class into the portfolios of the asset-owning elite. This relentless, systematic process is the engine of the great wealth transfer. It's a mechanism disguised as fiscal policy, where debt service acts as a powerful conveyor belt, moving wealth upward. Imagine a massive, old-fashioned balance scale. On one side, we place labor, the collective effort of every person earning a wage. On the other, we place capital, the accumulated assets of the wealthy. Each year, taxpayers fund the interest on the national debt. For fiscal year 2025 alone, these interest payments topped an astonishing $1.2 trillion. As that trillion-dollar payment is made, the side of the scale marked labor sinks under the immense weight. Simultaneously, the capital side soars, lifted by the unearned income flowing directly from the public treasury. The system is designed so that the very act of working and paying taxes actively deepens the chasm of economic inequality, ensuring those who already have the most receive even more. This leads to a logical question. If this debt is so burdensome, why don't we just pay it off? Why not rally together, tighten our belts, and eliminate it for good? The answer reveals the terrifying elegance of the system's design. If the national debt were ever paid off, the money supply itself would vaporize, triggering a catastrophic deflationary collapse. In our modern economy, money is created primarily through the issuance of debt, When a bank makes a loan, it creates new money. When the government issues a bond, it underpins the financial system. Debt and money are two sides of the same coin. To destroy one is to destroy the other. The system doesn't just tolerate debt, it requires it to exist. The record-breaking $38 trillion national debt isn't a sign that the system is broken. It's a sign that it's working exactly as intended, demanding ever-increasing levels of debt to simply keep functioning, further fueling the wealth transfer. The architects who designed this framework understood this perfectly. A $38 trillion debt is not a mistake or a policy failure. It is a business model. It is the most efficient machine ever created for concentrating wealth without the use of force. It operates silently, legitimized by complex economic jargon and the quiet compliance of those who don't know they're trapped. The bars of the cage are forged from financial illiteracy. But this is also where hope lies. While the system seems inescapable, there is a key that fits the lock. That key is financial education, not just learning how to budget or invest, but understanding the fundamental mechanics of this system, understanding how money is created, how debt functions, and how your labor is being leveraged. This knowledge transforms the invisible bars into something tangible, something you can see and navigate. It is the first and most critical step toward reclaiming your economic sovereignty.